All right. Well, today we are starting a brand new series. We are starting a brand new series called Pointing the Finger. I didn't realize it was going to be a little uncomfortable having this finger pointed at me the entire time. We're talking about pointing the finger. So I'm big on what the future could be. I like to dream about what people could be, what things could be. And Jesus was really good at this whole idea of vision casting. And with his followers, these people that followed him around everywhere, he said some crazy things about what the future could be. He said at one point, you are the salt of the earth, right? You people could be the kind of people who give this place flavor, right? He said you are the light of the world. There could be something about your lives that shines, that's attractive. And then in one of his last conversations with his closest friends, he sat them down and he said that everyone would know. One day, everyone would know that they followed him by the way that they loved each other, dreaming about what the future could be. So I recently read about this survey that was done by a group called the Barna Group, and they do all these surveys, all this research on society, culture, what's going on, and they asked people who don't consider themselves people of faith, church people. They asked them to describe the church today in one word, And of course, they got a lot of different responses that were all across the board. But shockingly, or maybe not so shockingly, depending on your background, over 90% of the responses were some form of the word judgmental. So what happened, right? What happened to this picture that Jesus painted of people that would live lives that were attractive, that would give this place flavor? Judgmental. Right now, and really for a while, the church has earned itself we have earned ourselves a reputation, if you consider yourself a church person, of what we are against rather than what we're for, of judging, of being judgmental, and when I say judging, right, that's a big umbrella term. It applies to so many different situations and so many different things. But in general, what we're talking about is when we see something, something that somebody's doing or something that they believe or some idea or some concept, we question it and then we deliver a verdict like a judge. That is not okay. I am not okay. It shouldn't be that way. And this is the thing that has come to define the church. Rather than being for, it's what we're against. And so we're doing a series over the next couple weeks on this whole topic of judging. How, should we judge? How do we judge? How do we respond when we are being judged? Because something needs to be done about this reputation that the church has earned. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I remember when I was younger, my parents, they used to go to church, and so we were around little, Christian circles. And for a long time, though I didn't really vocalize this, for a long time, I really wasn't sure if I wanted to be a Christian, a person of faith. I really wasn't sure. But what I did know for sure was that I didn't want to be known as one. If I was one, I wanted to keep it to myself. Because in all of the circles that I was in, it was never a good thing. No one was ever oh, cool, you're going to church instead of sleeping over our house on Saturday night because you got to wake up. It never put a positive spin on things. And so while I wrestled with some things on my own, it was maybe one day I'll be one of but I don't want to be one of those people that people know that. I'll be one of those undercover Christians, just in case there's something to it, just in case it's real, but I don't have to tell everybody about it. And it was because of this. because of this whole idea of being judgmental. And I would hear over and over and over again in church circles, like, you should not be ashamed of what you believe. And so there was this pressure to kind of come out with it and be like, yeah, okay, I am. This is what I believe. But looking back at it now, a little bit older and maybe a little more mature, I look back and I feel like I wasn't ashamed of what I believed, that like the God of the universe gave everything for us. I was ashamed of the reputation that the church had earned. I didn't want to be seen as someone who was judgmental. But there was someone in my life that like really started to change this for me. It was my cousin. His name's Dan. I remember when I was growing up, I went to school. He was older than me, but we went to the same school. And I got to watch him interact with people. And he was a person of faith, and people knew that. But in the school that I went to, there was like the church group, and then there was like the non-church group. And typically, at least in my school, those groups, there was a little divide between the two of them. They didn't really like to hang out with one another. But there were a few people that could kind of bridge this gap. And my cousin was one of them. People on both sides liked to be around him. And I remember thinking, like, what is it about him that people like? Like, how is it that my sister and we would stay up late and talk about this. I have an older sister, and we'd be like, Dan is a cool Christian. How does he do that? You know, like, he doesn't compromise, but even people that aren't like him seem to like him. And really what it came down to is that with him, people felt like he was for them. Like, he liked them. He was concerned for their good. He wasn't against them, constantly judging them. And if I'm being honest, when I was younger, I would look at him and be like, well, maybe there are some things about Christianity that he kind of like ignores, and that's what allows him to be cool. But what I came to realize was there was something about the way that he lived that a lot of people in church miss. And it had to do with how he handled this whole issue of judging. And so what do we do? What do we do with judging? Do we just get rid of it altogether and just say we're never going to say something's not okay? When I was a junior in high school, I had this friend. His name was Mitch. And we were friends for a long time, not just when I was a junior. It started like 7th grade, really, really close. But Mitch was the friend that could make you laugh when you weren't supposed to laugh, you know? You know those like friends when it's like totally inappropriate to start laughing and all they have to do is look at you and then you get the giggles? Okay. Well, this is what he did to me, right? And it could be the most like inappropriate of situations. Like there would be times where we were in class together and the teacher would be, you know, reprimanding the whole class and he would just look over at me. And all of a sudden I would just sit there and my stomach would start to twist because I would try not to laugh. But all I had to do was look, and I wasn't laughing at anything other than the fact that I wasn't supposed to be laughing. And I would sit there and I'd get in trouble for it and be like, what's so funny, Mr. Pizzicello? Would you like to share whatever? You know, and it's like, and it's all just because he would look at me, right? There was one time where a student was giving a speech. It was from Julius Caesar. And he was talking about duty, honor, and country. And I was 17 years old at this point, and every time he said duty, my friend would look over at me. And I'm like, there's no way, if the teacher asked me what I'm laughing at, there's no way I'm gonna be able to admit this. I'm 17 years old, right? Like, time to grow up a little bit. So anyway, one day I'm in class with Mitch, and we were in Spanish, and neither one of us were like, you know, all-stars in Spanish. And we had this exercise where you had to partner up with someone and translate these sentences together. And so we're sitting down, we're working on it, just struggling through. And all of a sudden, my teacher comes over, and she sits right next to us. And she looks at us. She's an older woman, but she's great, really nice. She looks at us, and she sits down, and she goes, "How are you doing, boys?" And I look at her, and she has this massive, like, dangler right on the tip of her nose. And I notice it, and Mitch is sitting right next to me, and he just looks at me. And I was like, oh, no. And I couldn't look at him, I couldn't look at her, and I'm sitting there, and my insides are just twisting as I try to hold it together. And eventually, like, she gets up and she walks away. And as soon as she walks away, Mitch looks at me. He goes, I'm going to tell her. And I was like, no, you are not going to tell her. This is going to be horrible, right? I'm like, so she comes back over. Immediately, I'm sweating. The vein in my forehead is like about to burst. I'm trying to control myself. And he looks at her as she's speaking. She comes over. She's still got it. She sits down right next to us, just the three of us. He looks up at her. He goes, Senora? She goes, yes, Senor Mitchell. He goes, have you ever heard of a chandelier? She goes, yeah, like a light that hangs from the ceiling. And he goes, no, like a booger that hangs from your nose. And right away she was like, oh no, and she like gets up, she runs away, she cleans herself up. But she comes back, and I'm just thinking, like, what in the world is about to happen now, right? She comes back, and she sits down with a huge smile on her face. She goes, thank you. And he was like, yeah, sure. And I look up, and I'm like, really? And she's like, thank you. I would have been walking around all day with that thing if you didn't point it out to me. If you didn't point out that there was something that I couldn't see. When it comes to this whole idea of judging, right? Assessing someone's behavior and coming to a conclusion about it, there is a time and there is a place to point something out for the good of someone else, right? Like out of concern for them, there is a time. And while we typically don't use the word judgment or judging in those situations, really what that is a good and helpful form of judgment. And so over the next couple weeks, what we're gonna do is look at four keys to good judgment. And here's what hangs in the balance. I think if you're a person that considers themselves a follower of Jesus or a person of faith, I think like this is too important for us to not talk about. Like we need to have a healthier approach to making decisions, to what people call judgment. We need to fix the fact that people think that the church is against them. But secondly, if you're like me, like the things that we're going to talk about over the next couple weeks might give you a sense of freedom. It wasn't until I learned these things that I felt it was like a burden lifted. Like it was not part of the job. I didn't have to be a person of faith who is a self-appointed moral police officer in society. Like it freed me from the feeling really that I was obligated to be against certain people. But secondly, if you're not a person of faith, maybe you've got questions, maybe you're just exploring, maybe you're like, I'm not sure about this, maybe you were threatened and that's why you're here today, right? If that's you, what I'm hoping is that today and maybe over the next couple weeks, like maybe this will do a little bit of damage control. Like maybe you'll see that the version of Christianity, like a judgmental, critical version of following Jesus that was presented to you, maybe wasn't the version that Jesus presented to the world, right? And maybe someone needs to tell you, like, it was not supposed to be like this. But secondly, when it comes to pointing the finger, not too long ago, in our culture, judging people was like a really bad thing, right? Like it was like, you don't judge people, you do your thing, I'll do my thing. Like, how dare you? The worst thing you could do is say that I'm right. But I don't know if you've realized, but lately, the pendulum has kind of swung the other direction. Where now, like a lot of us feel like we have a responsibility to point the finger, to call people out. There's a little bit of a blame game going on in our society right now. And really, it's just dividing us more. Because when we blame, people get defensive and divisive. And this, wherever you are on the faith spectrum, the stuff that we're going to talk about, I think it can help you no matter where you are on the faith spectrum. Whether you believe any of this or not, I believe that this is a better way. That there's a much better way, that like conflicts don't have to ruin relationships, that issues don't have to divide families and friends. There is a much better way. And so you can call this 4 keys to good judgment or 4 ways to beat the blame game. Here's our starting point, foundational principle. let you know right off the bat. The first thing, the first key to judging in a helpful way is to start with why. Ask yourself why. This is what we're going to come back to over and over and over again. Really, we're just scratching the surface, but this is the thing that everything else points to. The question is, why am I judging? Why do I feel the need to assess those ideas, those beliefs, like question that conduct and deliver a verdict about how I feel about it? What is it? And so stop, really, and think about this. Like, think about maybe right now you're in the middle of an issue. There's a little bit of judgment going on. He thinks this, she thinks that. Maybe it's in your home, maybe it's in your family, maybe it's with a friend, maybe it's at work. And you've made a decision. You've delivered a verdict. That's not okay. That's wrong. Why? What is the driving motivator? Maybe it's an emotion. What is the thing that is causing you to feel the need to make a judgment? For me, a lot of times it's hurt, right? Like maybe I'm personally hurt by something that somebody did. And so I feel the need, rather than to just talk about the fact that I'm hurt, be like, you know what? I just got to let you know what you did was wrong and that was not okay. Maybe it comes from a place of anger. Maybe, if we're honest, like maybe it comes from like wanting to feel a little bit better about ourselves, right? Like if you're a parent and you're doing your best to take care of your kids, but you don't feel like you're doing enough, which is most parents, like by the way, and you look at other parents and point out, well, I can't believe they do that and they let their kids do that. And did you see what he's like? That does make you feel better. Right? Like what really, if we're honest, what is it? And they're not always bad. Like maybe it's the desire to stand up for what's right. And so this is not going to be okay. I got to voice. What is it? Just what is it? Can you define what it is that is driving the need, the feeling, the desire to make a judgment, to express your opinion? The Apostle Paul, he was a really famous church leader. He wrote a lot of what we call the New Testament. He was one of the earliest followers of Jesus, and we look back at his teaching often. He wrote a letter to a church in the city called Corinth. He actually wrote multiple letters to them. And there's one letter that we have today. We call it 1 Corinthians, because as far as we can tell, it's the first letter they wrote to the Corinthians. And this church had a million reasons to point the finger. There was tons and tons and tons of judgment in this church. Like if you think you've been part of a dysfunctional church, this church, it just wins in so many different ways. There was somebody in the church who was sleeping with his father's wife. That's how it's described. Now, we don't know if that's his mother or if it's his stepmom or what it is, but he's like, are you serious? Are you like really saying that this is okay? They were judging each other like based on status in society. They were judging each other based on spirituality and what one person believes and what somebody else, and it was constant measuring, constant like questioning and delivering a verdict, like I'm better than you, but he's better than her. Constant measuring, constant judging. There was tons of dysfunction in this church. And Paul talks a lot about the division there, but as he's wrapping up this whole letter, he gives them a principle that applies to so many situations, and I think is the place we have to start when it comes to judging. He says in chapter 16, he says, let all that you do be done, not right, not perfectly, but in love. Let everything that you do. Another translation says, just do everything in love. In other words, like let love be the driving motivator for everything that you do. And so like the great thing about when he says do everything in love or let all that you do is we could just take out the phrase all that you do and throw a big blank here and put anything that you do. And the place for us today to start is with judging. Let your judging be done in love. Now, love is one of those words we use all the time, and it can kind of get abstract. It's like, okay, what does that mean? Does it mean I have to like smile when I'm doing it? Does it mean like I have to send a card or candy? Or like, what does it mean to judge someone in love? Here's like a more, at least it works better for me, right? The question to ask is this judgment? Am I judging for the good of the one being judged? Am I concerned for them? Like, is love, their good, the driving motivator for why I feel the need to express that I'm not okay with what they're doing or with what they believe, whether it's to them or to someone else? Is love the driving motivator? Like, what is the goal here of this judgment? Is it to make myself feel right? Is it to remind myself I'm on the right side? Is it to put them in their place? Is it to retaliate? Or am I genuinely concerned for their good? And when I say that, I don't mean like, can you go back later on and build an argument that like, okay, eventually this might work out for their good? Or is it the thing itself that is leading you to confront them? What's the goal? Is this for them, or really, is it for you? Is it for me when I feel the need to put someone in their place? Or is it out of concern for them? Now, I think it's important to make like a little disclaimer here, right? Every once in a while, you're gonna need to make a judgment for the good of someone else, right? So let's take my kids, for example. Let's say after church, I walk outside and I see you and you're talking to my son, little boy, Logan, and you just keep pinching him, right? For no reason. He's sitting there, he's crying, he's like, stop, but you just keep pinching him. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna walk over you, I'm gonna judge you and be like, hey, this is not okay, you should stop. For his good, not for your good, right? There are situations where you need to step in for the good of someone else. But that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is our interpersonal issues. When I have a problem with you because of a judgment that I've made about you. And even in the situation with my son, if you're a follower of Jesus, we are not ever given a license to disregard the good of the one being judged. Like, we're still supposed to enter into that situation thinking about them, thinking about how this can end in their good. And if you stop to think when you're being critical of someone, or when you disagree with someone, or when you have to confront someone, if you just stop and think, am I concerned for their good? This will totally, like automatically change the way that you handle the situation. So I'll give you an example. A little while ago, actually like a big while ago, I was on the phone with two people, and they were on two different sides of the issue, and they were both talking to me about it. And both of them wanted me to put the other one in their place and take their side. And we're going back and forth, and I'm trying to like stand in the middle, trying to like bring some peace to the situation here. And it was a woman and a man, and she was saying like, you got to tell him that he's off, that this is not okay. You have to stand up for what's right. And she's just like telling me what to do. And I go to him, it's the same thing. Oh no, she's totally out of line. This is not okay. And it wasn't something one did to the other. It was what they thought about a certain thing. I'm standing here, I'm like, really, is this my job? But we're going back and forth, right? And finally, on accident, really on accident, I wish I could say I did this on purpose, I didn't. But I stopped. It was actually in the conversation with the woman. And I said, all right, stop for a second. Put yourself in my position. If you really think that what you believe is what's best, then how would you need to approach the situation with him in a way that will end in him changing? And immediately she stopped and she's like, well, I don't know, I'd have to think about that. And then I was like, oh, that was interesting. And I went and did it on the other side as well. How would you, if what you think is what's best, how would you go about this for her good? And it was like, whoa, hold on. Why? Because like, and we do this out of good intentions, right? I'm not trying to be critical here. There's a feeling like we should stand up for what's right. But often we do it and we totally disregard the good of the other person. Like, if you really believe what you believe is right and the best way to go, then are we doing this in a way that shows that we're concerned for the other person? Think about it like this. Maybe it's in your home, right? Maybe you're married and you have a husband and he is always like checked out and on his phone. What you can do is you can judge him and you can confront him and be like, you're always checked out, you're totally disengaged, shame on you, right? Come on, and get on his case, right? Or you can stop and think about his good. And maybe like you wait until like, things simmer down a little bit. Maybe at some point you have a conversation and say, like one day, I don't want you to look back and realize that the kids never felt like you were paying attention to them. I don't want you to look back and feel like you missed all this because you were doing whatever on it. Like, do you see how if you just stop and engage with them, it changes everything? Automatically. Immediately. But when we're motivated by something else, whether it's to be on the right side, to make a point, to prove a point, it's the blame game, right? And that's when people get defensive and divisive, and it just, frankly, it just doesn't work. Just look at what's going on in our country right now. It just doesn't work. We're not more united. We're more divided than ever, and there's more blame than ever. And so, with every one of these, right, start with why. Am I motivated by love? Let all that you do be done in love. With every one of these, there's an offense and a defense. So that's probably not the best terminology. There's a pointing side and there's a being pointed at side. And so the question is, well, what do you do when the finger is pointed at you? When someone gets in your face and has something to say about you or judges you, whether it's nicely or not nicely, what do? You run the play again, same thing. Let's put that blank up there again. Let all that you do be done in love. Let your response to being judged be done in love. And so you stop and think about, why? Why is this person confronting me about this? Well, are they motivated by my good? Does this person really want what's best for me? If the answer is yes, well, that's pretty easy, right? They're for me. They're on my side. And so they've helped you. Maybe they're not, though. Maybe they're not really motivated by your good. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. Sometimes people could have the wrong motive, but the right point, right? You might have a chandelier, and maybe they just want to humiliate you. It doesn't mean you shouldn't wipe it. You may have an issue. Or maybe they're confronting you. They don't care about your good, and frankly, they're not even right with what they're talking about. Then what? How do we respond in love? A couple of years ago, well, actually it was a while ago now, it was when I was in college. I worked at a restaurant and I was a food runner, or a busboy. And so there were waiters who did the real work, and then they would be like, all right, go get me 5 salads, and I need this and that. And I was like, okay, and I would go run and whatever. And I was working one day with a waiter who had been there literally for decades. And it was a college job, right? And so I'm going back and forth, and it's a high-paced environment, and one day he just stops me. It seemed like out of nowhere, and just rips me to shreds, just tears into me. He's like, every time I talk to you, you walk away. What are you? And he just starts screaming at me. He's sitting there, I'm like, I'm just doing my job, right? And right away, I start to feel defensive. But now, most of the time, if you get to know me a little bit, you'll see I don't most of the time do the right thing. But in this circumstance, I felt like I was given a gift of perspective. And all of a sudden I stopped and just thought, this guy's been doing this at this restaurant for decades. And I'm probably the 15th punk that came through here this year. Maybe he's just tired of guys just walking away from him mid-sentence. Now, I could build an argument with well, I got to go get the salads, and I heard what you said, and I got the point, and it's that could. But if you just stop and say, okay, what's it like here? Consider it just immediately changes the way you handle the situation. And it was given that gift of perspective, it was 1,000 times easier to just be hey man, I'm sorry. I did not mean to disrespect you. And through that, then there was an apology from him. He's yeah, I guess I'm making a big deal. And the two of us got so much closer for the rest of the time that we were working there. It takes two to play the blame game. And if you don't throw it back, the game ends. Owning your junk is the best relationship hack you'll ever come across. Someone comes at you, figure out how big your slice of the pie is and own it. Even if it's at 1%, you own it and the guard just comes down. It takes two to play the blame game. Don't play. It hurts. It's not easy. Sometimes you got to take a hit. Sometimes the blame is wrong, but it takes two to play the blame game. I'm going to wrap up. I'll call the band back up here, but I'll leave you with this story. When I first came out of college, when I first got married, I was out of the house, and so the first thing I did was get a motorcycle because that was like the one thing I couldn't do when I was home. So I got a motorcycle. I know there's probably not a whole lot of motorcycle fans in this room. And I loved it, and it was great, but then we had kids, and then the motorcycle left. Well, this past year, we had an expedition. It was getting old. We ended up selling it, and I bought another motorcycle. And I loved it. It was like, for me, it was this release. It was fantastic. But needless to say, there were some people that really weren't excited about this motorcycle. Some people in my family, but like the chief of disapproval was my grandmother. Every time she saw me, we had to talk about the motorcycle. She'd be like, Lewis, you gotta get rid of this motorcycle. What are you doing? And every time it was a lecture. I definitely felt judged. She was assessing my behavior and delivering a verdict. This was not okay. This is not something that you should do. And so every time. One time I was driving her home, and we were driving her home. We were on the North Shore, driving down to the South Shore, and we're driving, like, it's like getting quiet, and she looks at me, she was like, Lewis, I'll give you $5,000, you sell that motorcycle. And I was like, no, Graham, I'm not gonna take your money. She's like, oh, and then she goes into the lecture again and again. She passed away not too long ago, but when she was in hospice, she was on morphine. And so as time went on, she was like more and more out of it. It was harder and harder to communicate with her. She started talking in full sentences, but gradually that just got like less and less. And one day I went in to visit her, and I walked in the room. My cousin Sam was there, and she looks at my grandmother. She's like, Graham, your grandson's here. Lewis is here. And my grandma she just moaned. She's like, oh, okay. And then Sam goes, he rode his motorcycle. And she goes, and it's like the most expressive I saw her at that point in her life. I ended up selling the motorcycle. I don't have it anymore. This whole time, I did feel judged by her. But there was not a second that I wasn't absolutely sure that she was concerned for my good, that she was for me. She wasn't trying to make a point. She was concerned about my well-being. Could you imagine when we talk about the reputation of the church? Like, there are going to be some things that we don't agree with in the world, that you don't agree with in the world. There's going to be times like stuff will happen in society, and we'll probably look at that because of what we believe, like, I'm not sure about this. But could you imagine if even those who didn't believe what we believe, even those who disagreed with us, looked at us and thought, like, yeah, I think they're wrong about that, but you know what, those people, there is no question about them. Like, they are for us. They genuinely want what's best for us. They're not like standing up high, pointing us down here. They're not feeling like they're holier or self-righteous but they genuinely want us to thrive. They're for us. And so while I may not agree with them, at least I know what they're doing out of love. For us to make any progress in that direction, we need to start with why. When we try to make a judgment, when we feel the need to make a judgment, and make sure the why is their good. It's out of love. And maybe then we'll change the way people think about the church and change the way people think about God. Let's pray. God, you are good to us. You care about us. And the reality is, in some ways, God, we are so much more judgmental than you are. You are forgiving, you are gracious, you are compassionate, and you've given everything for us to win our hearts. Would you help us to be a little bit more like you, a little bit more like Jesus, a little bit more full of grace, a little quicker to love. And God, when we feel the need to make a judgment, would you help us to move slowly and carefully so that the person on the other side will be totally sure that we're for them and not against them, that we're concerned for their good.